For years, the name Nancy Guthrie has lingered in the minds of those who stumbled across her story, drawn in by the promise of a mystery that never seemed to reach its conclusion. Countless people have tried to piece together the fragments of what happened, combing through contradictory reports, speculative theories, and incomplete accounts, only to find themselves no closer to the truth. What makes this case so enduring is not simply the mystery itself, but the way every new piece of information seemed to twist the narrative in an unexpected direction, leaving even the most determined investigators questioning what they thought they knew. The reality, as it turns out, is far more surprising than most people expected, and the truth was hiding in plain sight all along. At the heart of Nancy Guthrie's story lies a situation that defies straightforward explanation. The publicly available information was always fragmentary, and that lack of clarity became the engine driving endless speculation and confusion. Public interest grew not just because of the mystery itself, but because the facts that were initially shared simply did not line up with the surviving evidence. This disconnect left many wondering whether the truth was being deliberately concealed or simply misunderstood by everyone involved. What made the case particularly compelling was the presence of one critical element that remained consistently overlooked, a detail that would eventually change everything once it was finally brought to light. The puzzle was never just about missing information. It was about how the available details connected to a much larger, far less obvious truth. Mysteries often appear complicated because people are not asking the right questions, and that was precisely the situation with Nancy Guthrie. The most important aspect of her story was never hidden in some inaccessible place. It was waiting patiently for someone to approach the case from a fresh perspective. The story evolved from early news reports and local accounts that initially appeared quite straightforward. Over time, however, it transformed into an ongoing mystery that kept resurfacing in different online communities and public discussions. People attempted to piece together the narrative from conflicting sources, generating multiple potential motives and competing scenarios. The mystery persisted largely because its central element contained a fundamental detail that investigators initially chose to overlook. That absent component, combined with the extended period that passed without resolution, created barriers that consistently blocked the path toward any meaningful answer. Who was Nancy Guthrie? To truly understand why this story resonated so deeply with so many people, it is important to understand who Nancy Guthrie was beyond the headlines. She was more than a name attached to an unsolved case. She was a person whose life and circumstances became entangled with a chain of events that sparked widespread curiosity and concern. Nancy was known locally as a quiet individual with a closely knit circle of family and friends. Her life, while not extraordinary by conventional standards, reflected the everyday challenges and hopes that many people in her community shared. She had deep connections to a modest town where news traveled quickly and people remembered details vividly. Her relationships with those around her were a mixture of support and complexity, shaped by the social dynamics typical of small-town life. These relationships played a significant role in how stories about her began to spread, often with embellishments or misunderstandings attached. Personal reputation and community perception have a powerful influence on how a mystery develops, and Nancy's situation was no exception to that pattern. Beneath the surface of her apparently ordinary public image, Nancy's background hinted at deeper struggles that were not immediately visible to outsiders. That contrast between the normalcy of her public persona and the questions that emerged when inconsistencies appeared was precisely what made her case stand out. The more ordinary she seemed, the more intriguing the mystery became. Understanding the real person behind the headlines meant moving beyond rumors and focusing instead on concrete details drawn from her life and her actual interactions with others. Her story was complicated further by the fact that it was told through many different versions over time, each combining factual information with emotional content in varying proportions. Family perspectives, community rumors, and media coverage each contributed narrative threads that both clarified and confused the overall picture. The wider public became invested in Nancy's case because it touched on universal themes: trust, transparency, the fragility of information, and the human tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with assumptions rather than evidence. Early theories and misconceptions. Shortly after Nancy Guthrie's story became public, a range of theories emerged in an effort to explain the confusing circumstances surrounding her. These early ideas varied from relatively straightforward possibilities to elaborate and dramatic scenarios. However, the vast majority of them relied heavily on assumptions rather than verified facts, and this reliance only served to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. One of the most widely circulated misconceptions was the idea that Nancy's disappearance or unusual situation resulted from foul play. This explanation spread quickly because it offered a clean, if disturbing, cause for all the uncertainty. It satisfied the deeply human desire for neat conclusions. Despite intensive searches and detailed inquiries, however, no concrete evidence ever emerged to support this assumption. It remained popular simply because people struggled to make sense of the unusual facts they had available to them. Another early theory proposed that Nancy had voluntarily chosen to withdraw from her environment for reasons unknown to those around her. While this possibility could account for certain aspects of the situation, it conflicted directly with the testimonies of friends and family members who consistently described her as someone unlikely to simply walk away from everything without any communication. This fundamental contradiction illustrated how incomplete narratives can produce multiple, often entirely opposing conclusions simultaneously. Semantic confusion added another layer of difficulty. Minor discrepancies in timelines or descriptions were frequently taken as evidence of deliberate deception or organized conspiracy. This is a common pattern in prolonged mysteries. Small inconsistencies tend to fuel suspicion rather than healthy skepticism. The result was a rapid proliferation of rumors that became deeply entrenched in the public imagination despite having little or no factual foundation. Media coverage made matters worse by emphasizing the dramatic elements of the story over accuracy, shaping public opinion through emotion and storytelling rather than objective evidence. The confusion was further compounded by a lack of clear communication from authorities and those closest to Nancy. This silence, whether intentional or simply the result of genuine uncertainty, created an environment where speculation and conspiracy theories flourished unchecked. Without transparent and consistent updates, the narrative evolved into a patchwork of guesses and assumptions rather than a coherent, reliable account. Key events that deepened the confusion. As the story continued to unfold, specific events added new layers of complexity that made the mystery even harder to navigate. A seemingly ordinary timeline became tangled with conflicting accounts and unexpected developments that generated far more questions than answers. Small contradictions between witness statements and official records began to accumulate, making it increasingly difficult to determine what had actually happened. One pivotal source of confusion involved discrepancies in reported sightings of Nancy during the days surrounding the central incident. Some witnesses claimed to have seen her in locations that contradicted official timelines, while others recalled details that did not align with documented movements. These conflicting accounts cast serious doubt on the reliability of key testimonies and clouded every attempt to reconstruct the sequence of events accurately. The handling of physical evidence added to the problem. Important items connected to Nancy were recorded inconsistently, and some were reportedly lost during the early stages of the inquiry. This lack of thorough evidence management undermined confidence in the investigation and allowed skepticism to spread. The interpersonal dynamics within Nancy's community complicated matters further as friends, family members, and acquaintances offered contradictory recollections, sometimes shaped by emotional bias or an instinct to protect certain individuals. Balancing respect for privacy with the need for answers created tensions that significantly slowed the pursuit of clarity. Media coverage contributed its own share of distortion. Sensational headlines prioritized dramatic content over factual reporting, and over time, stories became embellished in ways that led people to accept falsehoods based on emotional resonance rather than verified information. The information overload created serious obstacles for anyone trying to distinguish between genuine evidence and unfounded speculation. The investigations that followed. Following the turbulent early period, a series of investigations took place in an effort to untangle the web of confusion surrounding Nancy's case. These efforts involve multiple agencies and committed individuals, all working toward the same goal of finding definitive answers. While initial examinations struggled with limited evidence and contradictory testimonies, more structured and methodical approaches gradually emerged. Official inquiries began promptly but faced significant obstacles, including incomplete documentation and uncooperative witnesses. Law enforcement officials worked diligently, but were often stymied by the fragmented nature of the information they received. In parallel, community members and independent researchers took remarkable initiative, collecting personal accounts, reviewing public records, and comparing various testimonies to identify inconsistencies and new leads. These grassroots efforts frequently brought fresh perspectives and uncovered details that formal investigations had overlooked. Technological advances also played a meaningful role as the investigation evolved. Improvements in forensic techniques and data analysis provided investigators with tools that earlier efforts had lacked entirely. Re-examinations of physical evidence using updated methods yielded new insights, and digital reconstruction of timelines helped clarify certain key contradictions. Despite these advances, challenges related to jurisdictional disputes and restricted access to certain information continued to create barriers that required patience and persistence to navigate. A crucial breakthrough eventually came from a carefully coordinated review of witness statements conducted years after the initial events. This review exposed previously unnoticed correlations and inconsistencies, allowing investigators to refine the timeline and identify which leads had been false ones all along. This step marked a fundamental shift from reactive to strategic investigation. New evidence comes to light. Years after the initial investigations, new evidence began to surface that challenged everything previously believed about the case. This fresh information was not the product of a single dramatic discovery, but rather the result of painstaking re-examination of overlooked details and underappreciated sources. Forensic experts revisited physical evidence with far greater precision than had been possible in the earlier stages, and these refined analyses revealed subtle clues that had been missed entirely during previous examinations. One particularly significant development came from newly uncovered communications and records connected to Nancy's last known whereabouts. These documents provided clearer context around her movements and state of mind, allowing investigators to assemble a far more coherent timeline. What had appeared to be contradictions in the earlier stages of the investigation now made complete sense when placed within this broader framework. It became evident that certain facts had been misinterpreted simply because they lacked the supporting context that these new records provided. Witness statements that had been previously dismissed or deemed unreliable were revisited and cross-referenced against each other with fresh eyes. Unexpected patterns emerged where there had previously been only chaos. Some testimonies aligned in surprising ways, shedding light on key moments that had remained unexplained for years. Physical evidence, once considered irrelevant or impossible to analyze, was re-examined using improved techniques, including enhanced imaging and chemical analysis. These findings suggested alternative scenarios that had never been fully considered, painting a strikingly different version of events from the one that had dominated public understanding. Community involvement proved invaluable during this phase as well. Renewed public interest led some residents to come forward with previously withheld information or long-forgotten memories. This collective input expanded the available information significantly and demonstrated the genuine value of community memory as a research tool that can complement and support scientific findings. Putting the pieces together and revealing the truth. Bringing all of this new evidence together with the existing body of information required a methodical, open-minded, and collaborative approach. Investigators, analysts, and community members worked closely together to reconcile the disparate pieces, weighing each detail with care